Find a comfortable place to lie down. Close your eyes if you like, breathe slowly, and let yourself sink into the story. The Quiet Promise. He learned the shape of a heartbeat before he learned the shape of letters. As a child, he would press his small palm against his mother's wrist and count the steady, patient drum beneath the skin, as if the rhythm itself were a lesson. That steady beat became a kind of promise, a promise that things could be mended, that pain could be soothed, that the fragile order of a body could be coaxed back into balance. He carried that promise like a small stone in his pocket, warm from the sun, and when he grew older, he would turn it over with his thumb and remember the sound of it. The town where he grew up was not large, but it had a hospital with a tired elevator and a night nurse who always smelled faintly of lavender. He spent afternoons there, not as a patient, but as a volunteer, sweeping floors and carrying charts, watching the way the nurses moved with a quiet efficiency that made the whole place feel like a careful machine. He loved the way the doctors spoke, precise, measured, as if each word were a scalpel. He loved the way they looked at a wound and saw not only the tear but the story behind it. He wanted that kind of seeing. He wanted to be the person who could hold a trembling hand and know what to do. At university, he found himself surrounded by diagrams and Latin names, by cadaver labs and late-night study sessions that smelled of coffee and paper. The first year felt like learning a new language, the language of cells and tissues, of pulses and murmurs. He learned to read the body as if it were a map, to trace the routes of arteries like rivers on a chart. He learned to be patient with his own mistakes, to let the slow accumulation of knowledge build a steady foundation. There were nights when the weight of it all pressed on him, the responsibility, the endless lists of things to remember. But there were also mornings when he would stand in the anatomy hall and feel a quiet awe, as if he were in the presence of something sacred. He was not a loud person. He did not seek attention. He preferred the small, deliberate acts, the careful knot of a suture, the way a bandage could be smoothed until it looked like nothing at all. He liked the ritual of washing his hands before a procedure, the way the water ran clear, and the world seemed to pause for a moment. He liked the textbooks that smelled of dust and possibility. He liked the way knowledge could be passed from one hand to another, from teacher to student, like a torch. One summer, between semesters, he accepted an invitation that felt like a pause between chapters. A small research group was organizing a short field trip to study tropical plants, a chance to observe flora that might one day yield new medicines. It was meant to be a brief excursion, a few weeks of careful note-taking and gentle exploration. He imagined it as a quiet interlude, a place to breathe before returning to the steady grind of lectures and exams. He packed a small bag, a notebook, and a head full of diagrams, and he left with the same calm determination he brought to everything. The journey there was a slow unspooling of landscape, city to highway to a ribbon of road that narrowed and then disappeared into green. The air changed as they moved, becoming heavier and more fragrant, as if the world itself had been steeped in a different kind of breath. He felt a lightness he had not known he needed. For a few days, the group moved with the easy rhythm of people who are curious and careful. They catalogued leaves, measured stems, and took photographs that would later be filed away in the quiet rooms of laboratories. He found himself fascinated by the way local healers could name a plant and know, without hesitation, what it could do. Their knowledge was not written in textbooks. It lived in hands and in stories. On the 5th day, a storm came that was not in any forecast. It arrived with a suddenness that felt like a page torn from a different book. Wind that bent the trees until they seemed to bow, rain that fell in sheets, and a sky that closed over like a lid. The group sought shelter, but the path back to the vehicle had been washed away by a small, angry river that had not been there before. They waited, and then they waited some more. The storm passed, but the landscape had changed. A bridge that had been their route was gone, and the map in their hands no longer matched the world beneath their feet. They tried to find another way. They walked with the careful optimism of people who believe that every problem has a solution. But the jungle is patient and indifferent. It rearranges itself in ways that are not meant for human plans. On the second day of searching, a misstep separated him from the group. He had been following a narrow game trail, his mind half on the notes he wanted to make and half on the rhythm of his own breath, when the ground gave way beneath him. He fell into a shallow ravine, the world tilting and then snapping back into a green, close silence. When he climbed out, the path behind him had vanished like a memory. At first he thought he would find his way back. He had maps and a compass and a head full of knowledge. He walked with the steady, methodical pace he had learned in the hospital corridors, marking trees and leaving small piles of stones to guide him. But the jungle is a place that does not always answer to human logic. Days blurred into one another. Food grew scarce. The nights were full of unfamiliar sounds. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of animals, the whisper of insects that seemed to speak in a language he could not translate. He learned to move slowly, to listen before he spoke, to watch for the small signs that meant water or fruit. He learned to sleep with one eye open and one ear tuned to the world. When the tribe found him, it was not with the dramatic urgency of a rescue in a film. They came like a tide of quiet curiosity, watching him from the edges of his campfire light. They did not rush to him. They observed, as if assessing whether he was a danger or a curiosity. They wrapped him in leaves and offered him water, and when he could speak, they listened to his story with a patience that felt like a balm. Their leader, an older woman with hair like silver threads and eyes that had seen many seasons, touched his forehead and smiled in a way that made him feel less like a stranger and more like a patient in need of care. They called him by a new name, a soft syllable that fit the rhythm of their language. He learned to answer to it, to let it settle into him like a new garment. They taught him the names of plants by the light of a fire, pointing to leaves and roots and telling him what each could do. Their knowledge was not written in Latin or printed in journals. It lived in stories and in the careful repetition of practice. He watched as they prepared poultices and teas, as they bound wounds with strips of bark and sang low, steady songs that seemed to steady the hands that worked. He began to see how their methods were not opposed to the science he had learned, but were another way of reading the body and the world. In return, he shared what he could. He showed them how to clean a wound with a steady hand, how to tie a knot that would hold, how to listen for a pulse and know what it might mean. He did not teach them the names of bones or the Latin terms for muscles. He taught them small, practical things that could be used in the moment. They accepted his help with a quiet gratitude, and in the exchange, something shifted. His textbooks, which had once felt like the only path to healing, began to sit beside the living knowledge of the tribe like two different kinds of light. He realized that medicine could be both a science and a craft, that the heart of healing was not only in the facts, but in the hands that used them. Nights in the village were long and gentle. He would lie awake and listen to the soft chorus of the jungle, the way the leaves sighed and the distant river hummed like a lullaby. He would think of the anatomy hall and the antiseptic smell of the hospital, and he would think of the woman who had wrapped his head in leaves and taught him the name of a root that could stop bleeding. He felt a strange, growing peace, a sense that he had been led, not away from his dream, but toward a different way of fulfilling it. The promise he had carried since childhood, the promise of the heartbeat beneath the skin, had not been broken. It had simply grown larger, taking in new rhythms and new languages. As the days lengthened into weeks, he began to move with the rhythm of the place. He rose with the light, walked the narrow paths, and learned to read the small signs that meant rain or fruit. He learned to make a poultice that soothed a fever, to fashion a splint from a branch, to calm a frightened child with a steady voice. Each small success was a quiet revelation. Each failure was a lesson that did not shame him, but taught him to be more careful, more attentive. He began to understand that healing was not only about curing, but about presence. The way a hand could steady a trembling shoulder, the way a voice could slow a racing breath. And in the quiet hours, when the fire had burned low and the stars were sharp and distant, he would take out his notebook and write. He wrote not only the names of plants and the measurements of pulses, but the stories the tribe told him. The way they spoke of the land as a living thing, the way they honored the small medicines that grew in the shade. He wrote because writing made the world hold still for a moment, and in that stillness he could see the shape of his own path. He did not yet know where it would lead, whether he would return to the university or remain in the jungle, but he felt, with a quiet certainty, that his life had become a bridge between two kinds of knowing. He had come to learn, and in learning he had begun to teach. He had come to be healed, and in being healed he had begun to heal others. The heartbeat he had felt as a child was still there, steady and patient. It had not changed. Only his understanding of it had widened, like a river that finds new tributaries. He slept that night with his hand on his chest, feeling the small, sure drum beneath the skin, and he whispered a promise to himself: to listen, to learn, and to keep the steady work of healing at the center of everything he would do. The quiet work of hands. Days folded into one another with a softness that surprised him. The rhythm of the village was not measured by clocks, but by small, steady tasks. The rising of mist over the river, the time it took for the bread-like fruit to brown in the sun, the hour when the children's laughter would thin into the hush of evening. He learned to wake with the light and to move with a deliberate slowness that felt like a kind of prayer. Each motion had a purpose. Each purpose had a place in the weave of life. The tribe's healer, the woman with silver thread hair, moved with a certainty that came from years of practice. She taught him to hold a leaf as if it were a fragile instrument, to crush it between thumb and forefinger until its scent rose like a memory. She taught him to listen to the stories that accompanied each remedy: a tale of a child who had been soothed by a bitter tea, a memory of a fever that had been cooled by a damp cloth and a lullaby. These stories were not mere folklore. They were a living archive, a way of remembering what had worked and what had not. He began to understand that knowledge could be carried in narrative as surely as it could be carried in ink. He practiced the small things first. He learned to bind a wound with strips of bark so that the skin could breathe and the edges could knit together. He learned to fashion a splint from a straight branch and soft cordage, to steady a broken limb without causing further harm. He learned to make a poultice that drew out infection, not by naming the bacteria that might be present, but by observing what the body needed: warmth, gentle pressure, time. Each success was a quiet confirmation. Each failure was a lesson that arrived without blame. The tribe watched him with a patient curiosity. At first, they treated him as a guest, a strange man who had fallen from the sky and needed care. But as he worked, as his hands learned the rhythm of their remedies and his voice learned the cadence of their songs, their curiosity softened into trust. They began to bring him small problems: a child with a fever that would not break, a hunter with a deep cut that had been stitched poorly, an elder whose joints had grown stiff with years. He approached each case with the same careful attention he had learned in the anatomy hall, but now his tools were different. A strip of cloth, a bowl of warm water, a handful of leaves whose names he was still learning. There were nights when he would sit by the fire and think of the sterile lights of the hospital, of the precise instruments and the neat rows of labeled jars. He missed the clarity of textbooks, the way a diagram could make a complex system feel comprehensible. Yet he also felt a growing respect for the way the tribe's knowledge had been honed by generations of attention. Their remedies were not the result of a single experiment, but of countless small trials, of hands that had tried and adjusted and tried again. He began to see his own training as part of a larger conversation rather than a solitary truth. One morning, a boy arrived at the village with a wound that had been left to fester. The skin around it was dark and angry, and the boy's face was drawn with pain. The tribe's healer moved with a quiet authority, and he watched as she cleaned the wound with water warmed over the fire, as she applied a paste of ground root and ash. He suggested a technique he had learned in the university: a gentle irrigation to remove debris, a careful dressing to keep the wound clean. She listened, then nodded, and together they worked in a rhythm that felt like two languages finding a common grammar. The boy's breathing eased, the color returned to his cheeks. When the work was done, the healer placed her hand on his shoulder and said something in her language that made him feel seen. That evening, as the village settled into its slow dusk, a different kind of challenge arrived. A fever had begun to move through the settlement like a shadow, first in one hut and then in another. It was not a sudden, violent outbreak, but a steady, creeping malaise. Low energy, a dull ache, a heat that would not relent. The healer and he moved from house to house, offering teas and cool compresses, listening to chests and watching for signs that might indicate a deeper trouble. He felt the old, familiar tug of responsibility, the same tug that had driven him through long nights of study, and he worked with a focused calm. They did not have the laboratory tests he had known in the university. There were no blood counts or cultures to tell them what invisible thing might be causing the fever. Instead, they had observation, patience, and a careful record kept in his notebook: the time of onset, the foods eaten, the plants used, the way the fever responded to different treatments. He wrote in the margins the names the tribe used for symptoms, and he sketched the leaves of plants that seemed to help. Each entry was a small experiment, a data point in a living study. As the days passed, patterns began to emerge. A particular tea, made from a bitter leaf that smelled faintly of citrus, seemed to ease the fever's edge. A cooling compress of crushed vine leaves brought relief to those whose skin burned. He recorded these observations with the meticulousness of a student and the tenderness of a caregiver. He did not claim to have found a cure. He described what he had seen and how the body had responded. The healer nodded at his notes and added her own annotations in the margins, a shorthand of symbols that he slowly learned to read. The work was not without its failures. There were nights when a patient's breathing grew shallow and the hands that had been steady began to tremble. There were moments when he felt the old, sharp ache of helplessness, the same ache that had sometimes visited him in the hospital when a life slipped away despite every effort. In those moments, the tribe's rituals offered a different kind of solace. A circle of people who sang low, steady songs while the healer and he worked, a communal presence that seemed to hold the fragile thread of life with reverence. He learned that healing was not only about the body, but about the way a community gathered around its suffering. In the quiet hours between tending the sick, he continued his private experiments. He combined small amounts of plant extracts with careful observations, noting how a poultice changed the color of a wound or how a tea altered the rhythm of a fever. He was careful not to rush. He tested one variable at a time and recorded the results. He learned to respect the limits of his knowledge and to ask for the counsel of the healer when he was unsure. She, in turn, began to ask him questions about the mechanisms he had learned in school. Why a certain herb might reduce swelling, how the body's immune response could be supported. Their conversations were gentle and curious, a meeting of two traditions that both sought the same end. Trust deepened in small, almost invisible ways. A mother who had once watched him with guarded eyes now left her child in his care while she gathered water. A hunter who had been skeptical of his methods came to him with a thorn embedded deep in his palm. When the man's hand healed, he clasped the young healer's forearm in a gesture that felt like acceptance. The children began to follow him on his walks, asking for stories and for the names of plants. He taught them to feel for a pulse and to notice the way a leaf smelled when crushed. In teaching, he found a new kind of joy, the slow, patient passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. As the seasons shifted and the rains returned in a softer, more predictable rhythm, he found himself thinking of the future with a new clarity. The notebooks he filled with sketches and observations were no longer merely a record of survival. They were the beginnings of something he could not yet name. He dreamed, in quiet moments, of combining the precision of his academic training with the deep, place-based knowledge of the tribe. He imagined a medicine that honored both the laboratory and the land, that treated not only symptoms, but the whole of a person's life. Yet with that dream came a gentle unease. He knew that knowledge could be fragile, and that the act of taking something from a community could be a kind of violence if done without care. He thought of the way the tribe had welcomed him, of the stories they had entrusted to him, and he felt a responsibility to protect what had been shared. He resolved to be careful, to record not only the names of plants, but the contexts in which they were used, the songs that accompanied them, the rituals that gave them meaning. He would not rush to publish or to claim. He would let the work grow slowly, like a root finding its way through the dark. One evening, as the fire burned low and the village settled into a hush, the healer called him to her side. She handed him a small, folded leaf and spoke in her language, her voice soft and deliberate. He listened, feeling the weight of the moment. She was offering him a trust that went beyond the practical, a blessing, a recognition that he had become part of their circle. He accepted the leaf with both hands, feeling the rough texture against his palm, and he bowed his head in a quiet promise. The promise was not a vow of permanence. It was a promise to continue the work with humility, to let his hands be guided by both science and story. It was a promise to listen more than he spoke, to learn more than he taught. As he lay down that night, the sounds of the jungle folding around him like a soft blanket, he felt the steady drum of his own heartbeat and the slow, sure rhythm of a life that was beginning to find its shape. He did not yet know what discoveries might come, nor whether he would ever return to the university halls. He only knew that each day offered a small, sacred task: to be present, to learn, and to keep the quiet work of his hands true. The language of leaves. The village taught him to slow down in ways his textbooks never had. Where the university had prized speed of recall and the ability to recite facts under pressure, the jungle required a different kind of attention, a patience that watched for patterns across days and seasons, a listening that waited for the smallest change. He learned to notice the way a leaf drooped before a storm, the way a child's laugh thinned when a fever began, the way a wound that would scar badly first showed a certain dullness at the edge. These were not dramatic revelations. They were quiet, incremental observations that, when gathered together, formed a map of living things. He began to keep a new kind of notebook. The pages were filled with sketches that were less precise than the diagrams he had drawn in anatomy class, but more alive. The curve of a root, the way a stem forked, the texture of a leaf-S underside. He wrote down the healer's stories beside his own notes, the old woman's shorthand of symbols, and the little songs she hummed while she worked. He recorded the times of day when certain remedies were prepared, the way a poultice was applied with a clockwise motion, the way a compress was left until the skin cooled. He learned that context mattered. The same plant used in one season might be prepared differently in another. A leaf that soothed a fever when brewed fresh could irritate if left to sit. As he collected these details, his mind began to weave connections between the formal knowledge he had been taught and the practical wisdom of the tribe. He thought about inflammation not only as a textbook process of cells and cytokines, but as a visible, tactile change in tissue, heat, swelling, a change in color that could be influenced by temperature, by pressure, by the presence of certain plant compounds. He began to hypothesize, quietly and carefully, about why certain combinations of herbs seemed to work better than single plants alone. He tested small variations, always with consent and with the healer's guidance. A little less of one root, a slightly longer infusion, a different method of application. He recorded outcomes with the same rigor he had used in the lab, but his measures were different. A child's appetite returning, a wound's edges closing, a fever's steady decline. The tribe's elders watched his experiments with a mixture of amusement and approval. They had seen outsiders come and go, some who took and left, others who tried to change things too quickly. They appreciated that he asked rather than assumed, that he sought permission and listened when told no. The healer, in particular, became both mentor and collaborator. She would sit beside him as he mixed small batches of tea, her fingers moving with the ease of someone who had done this work for decades. She would taste a brew and close her eyes, then offer a single word in her language that meant, roughly, balance. He learned to trust that word as a measure as valid as any lab result. One afternoon, a woman arrived carrying a child who had been bitten by a venomous snake. The bite was recent, the swelling was beginning to spread, and the child's face was pale with shock. The village moved with a focused calm. The healer and he worked together, their movements synchronized by practice and urgency. They cleaned the wound, applied a cooling poultice, and used a tight band of woven fiber to slow the spread of venom without cutting off circulation. He thought of the emergency protocols he had learned in the hospital, the careful monitoring of vital signs, the need to keep the patient calm, and he applied them here with the tools at hand. The child's breathing steadied. The color returned slowly to the cheeks. It was not a miraculous cure, but it was a demonstration of how two traditions could meet in a moment of crisis and produce a better outcome than either might alone. That night, as the village settled and the stars came out like scattered lanterns, the healer spoke to him about responsibility. She told him that knowledge could be a kind of power, and that power required humility. She reminded him that the plants they used belonged to the land and to the people who had tended them for generations. He listened, feeling the weight of her words. He had come with the desire to learn and to help, but he now understood that his role was also to protect and to honor. He promised, silently and then aloud, that he would not take what was given without giving back. In the weeks that followed, small discoveries began to accumulate. A tea made from a bitter leaf and a sweet root seemed to reduce the intensity of fevers more reliably than the bitter leaf alone. A poultice that combined crushed bark with a cooling vine reduced swelling faster than the bark by itself. He documented these findings with careful notes. The proportions used, the method of preparation, the observed effects. He did not rush to publish or to claim. Instead, he refined his methods, repeating trials and noting variations. Each success was modest but meaningful, a step toward a deeper understanding of how the body and the land interacted. The children of the village became his eager apprentices. They would follow him on walks and ask questions with the blunt curiosity of youth. He taught them to feel for a pulse, to notice the warmth of a fever, to recognize the smell of crushed leaves. In return, they taught him the names of small things he had overlooked. The insect that pollinated a certain flower, the time of day when a particular root was easiest to dig, the song that accompanied a healing ritual. Their laughter and questions lightened the long hours of work and reminded him that medicine was not only a science, but a communal art. There were also moments of doubt. He missed the certainty of tests and the reassurance of numbers. He worried that his observations might be biased, that his small sample sizes could mislead him. He worried about the ethics of experimenting in a community that had welcomed him. Each time doubt crept in, he returned to the healer and to the elders, asking for their counsel. They would listen and then offer a story or a proverb that reframed his worry as part of the work. That learning is a long river, not a sudden flood. That patience is the true measure of a healer. As the seasons shifted, he began to think beyond immediate remedies. He considered prevention, how the village's diet, its daily rhythms, and its relationship to the land influenced health. He observed that those who walked the forest paths regularly seemed less prone to certain ailments, perhaps because of the steady exposure to small doses of local microbes that trained their immune systems. He noticed that communal rituals, shared meals, songs, and the tending of gardens created a social fabric that supported mental and emotional well-being. These observations nudged him toward a broader vision of medicine, one that included environment, culture, and community as integral parts of health. One morning, while tending a small garden plot with a group of women, he noticed a pattern in the way certain plants were intercropped. A bitter herb grew beside a flowering vine, and the two seemed to thrive together. He asked about it, and an elder explained that the plants had been paired for generations because one repelled pests while the other enriched the soil. The explanation was practical and ecological, but it sparked an idea in him. Perhaps some of the combinations used in remedies were not arbitrary, but reflected an ecological wisdom that optimized the plants active compounds. He began to sketch out hypotheses, not as definitive claims, but as questions to be explored with care. The village, in turn, began to ask him questions about the wider world. They were curious about the hospital lights and the machines he had described, about the way cities organized care. He answered as best he could, careful not to romanticize or to denigrate either way of life. He spoke of sterile rooms and precise instruments, of the comfort that numbers could bring, and of the loneliness that sometimes accompanied clinical spaces. He told them that both systems had strengths and blind spots, and that perhaps the most honest work was to learn from both. By the time the rains softened into a long, warm season, his notebooks were thick with observations and sketches. He had become, in the eyes of the village, a bridge, someone who could translate between two languages of healing. He felt the truth of that role like a steady weight on his shoulders, not a burden, but a responsibility he accepted willingly. Each day offered new small tasks and new small joys. A child's fever breaking, a wound closing without infection, a woman's gratitude expressed in a quiet nod. The work was not glamorous. It was slow and repetitive and often invisible to the hurried eye. But it was real, and it was enough. And in the quiet moments, when he sat by the river and watched the light move across the water, he would touch the small stone in his pocket, the promise he had carried since childhood, and feel how it had changed. It was still a promise, but now it was braided with other promises. To the healer who had taught him, to the tribe that had sheltered him, and to the land that had given its medicines. He did not yet know where this braided path would lead, but he felt, with a calm certainty, that he was walking it with hands that had learned to be both careful and kind. The quiet of questions. The months folded into a rhythm that felt less like a calendar and more like a slow, patient breathing. He woke with the birds and moved through the day with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to value small things. The way a child's skin warmed under a cloth, the way a poultice cooled a fevered forehead, the way a wound's edge softened when it was kept clean and given time. The village's life was stitched together from these small attentions, and he found himself learning not only techniques, but a way of being, a steadiness that steadied others. As his hands grew surer, his questions grew deeper. He no longer asked only what a plant did. He asked why it seemed to do it. He no longer accepted that a remedy worked because it had always worked. He wanted to understand the patterns behind the practice. These questions were not born of impatience, but of a gentle curiosity that had been sharpened by years of study and tempered by the humility of the jungle. He began to think in two languages at once: the precise, mechanistic language of the university and the narrative, relational language of the tribe. One evening, after the work of the day had quieted and the firelight made the faces around him soft and familiar, he sat with the healer and spoke of a pattern he had noticed. Certain combinations of plants, when prepared together, seemed to produce effects that were more than the sum of their parts. A bitter leaf paired with a sweet root eased fevers more reliably. A cooling vine combined with crushed bark reduced swelling faster than either alone. He described his observations carefully, avoiding any claim of certainty. The healer listened, her eyes reflecting the fire, and then she told him a story. She spoke of an elder who had once tended a garden and who believed that plants were not solitary beings, but neighbors in a living conversation. When two plants grew side by side, she said, They shared more than soil. They shared light and shade, insects and the subtle chemistry of their roots. Over generations, people had learned which neighbors supported one another and which did not. The healer's story was not a scientific explanation in the terms he had learned at university, but it was a way of seeing relationships, ecological, chemical, and cultural, that resonated with his own observations. Encouraged, he began to design small, careful inquiries. He did not call them experiments in the way his professors might have. He called them tests of attention. With the healer's blessing, he prepared small batches of remedies, varying one element at a time and watching how the body responded. He recorded outcomes in his notebook with the same meticulousness he had once reserved for lab results. The time of day, the age of the patient, the weather, the method of preparation. He noted not only whether a fever fell, but how the patient's appetite returned, how sleep deepened, how the color of the skin shifted. These were holistic measures, and they mattered to the people whose lives were touched by his work. Word of his careful observations spread beyond the village. Travelers and neighboring settlements began to bring questions and small ailments, and he found himself balancing the role of student and practitioner. He was careful not to overreach. He never presented his findings as definitive cures. He spoke of them as observations, as possibilities to be tested further. The healer supported this approach, reminding him that humility was the true companion of knowledge. She taught him to ask permission before trying something new, and to share credit for any success with the land and the people who had tended it. In the quiet hours, he also wrestled with a different kind of question, the question of belonging. The university had been his chosen path, the place where he had learned the language of anatomy and the discipline of clinical reasoning. The jungle had become his unexpected classroom, a place where he had been welcomed and where his hands had found new purpose. He felt the tug of two worlds, each offering a different kind of truth. Sometimes, in the hush before dawn, he would imagine himself back in the anatomy hall, the antiseptic light and the precise instruments, and he would feel a pang of longing. Other times, as he watched a child's fever break beneath the shade of a palm, he felt a deep, quiet contentment that made the thought of leaving seem impossible. A turning point came with a patient who tested both his skills and his conscience. An elder from a neighboring settlement arrived with a chronic condition that had been slowly eroding his strength. The man's breath came in shallow waves. His joints were stiff and unyielding. The healer and he worked together, offering teas and gentle massages, adjusting diets and tending the man's sleep. Progress was slow, and there were days when the elder's face seemed to sink with the weight of time. He felt the old ache of helplessness, the same ache that had sometimes visited him in the hospital when a life could not be saved despite every effort. One night, as the elder's breathing grew more labored, the healer took him aside. She spoke in low tones about the limits of what they could do with the tools at hand. She also spoke of the possibility of a journey, a trip to a distant clinic where a procedure might ease the man's suffering. The suggestion carried with it 1,000 complications: the distance, the cost, the disruption to the elder's life, and the cultural dissonance of moving from a place of communal care to a clinical setting. He listened, feeling the tension between two kinds of care: the slow, relational tending of the village and the targeted, technological interventions of the clinic. In the end, the decision was not his alone. The elder, with a clarity that surprised them all, chose to remain. He spoke of a life woven into the land, of children and stories and the small rituals that made each day meaningful. He accepted the care the village could offer and asked that his remaining days be spent among his people. The choice was a quiet lesson for him. That medicine is not only about prolonging life at any cost, but about honoring the life that is lived. It was a lesson that reshaped his understanding of success and failure. Around that time, a small, unexpected discovery began to take shape. While tending a series of patients with a persistent cough that seemed to linger after seasonal rains, he noticed that those who had been given a certain aromatic steam, a practice the women used when preparing food, seemed to recover more quickly. He did not leap to conclusions. He documented the pattern, asked the healer about the practice, and learned that the steam had long been used as a comfort measure during colds. He began to wonder whether the steam's warmth and the volatile compounds released by the herbs might be easing congestion or soothing irritated airways. He sketched out careful notes and, with the healer's permission, tried small variations. Different herbs, different durations, always observing and recording. The results were modest but consistent. Patients reported easier breathing and deeper sleep after the steam treatments. He wrote the observations down and shared them with the healer, who nodded and added her own notes about which herbs were considered safe and which were used only sparingly. They did not claim to have discovered a cure. They described a supportive practice that seemed to help in certain contexts. The humility of their language mattered. They framed their findings as contributions to a living body of knowledge, not as definitive answers. As his confidence grew, so did his sense of responsibility. He began to think about how to protect the knowledge he was gathering. He worried about outsiders who might come and take plants or recipes without understanding the cultural context. He worried about the commercialization of remedies that were woven into rituals and relationships. He spoke with the healer and the elders about these concerns, and together they devised simple safeguards: a practice of asking permission, a commitment to credit the tribe's knowledge, and a promise to share any benefits that might arise. These conversations were not legal contracts, but moral agreements rooted in respect. In the quiet that followed, he found himself returning again and again to the small stone in his pocket, the promise he had carried since childhood. It had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of why he had chosen this path. The promise had not narrowed. It had expanded to include the land and the people who had taught him. He felt the steady pulse of his own intention, to learn, to serve, and to hold what he learned with care. The jungle had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was this: that knowledge without humility can harm, and that the true work of a healer is to listen first and act with reverence. Night after night, as the village settled and the stars embroidered the sky, he would sit by the fire and write. His notebooks grew thicker, not with the sterile ink of detached observation, but with the warm, messy handwriting of someone who had come to love the work itself. He wrote the names of plants and the songs that accompanied them, the times of day when remedies were prepared, the stories the elders told about why certain practices had been kept. He wrote about failures as honestly as successes, because he had learned that both were teachers. And in the margins, in small, careful script, he began to sketch ideas for a future that might bridge the two worlds he loved: a medicine that honored both the precision of science and the wisdom of place. The slow work of discovery. The days grew longer in a way that felt generous rather than hurried. He moved through them with a patience that had become almost physical, a kind of muscle memory in his hands and in the cadence of his breath. Each morning began with the same small ritual: a walk along the river to gather water, a careful inspection of the garden plots, a slow turning through his notebook to remind himself of what had been tried and what had not. The village had become a living laboratory of a kind he had never imagined, and he treated it with the reverence of someone who knows that small things, tended over time, can become great. His experiments remained modest and respectful. He never forced a trial. He proposed, he asked, and he waited for consent. When an elder agreed to try a new combination of herbs for a chronic ache, they did so with the understanding that the healer and he would watch closely and stop if anything seemed wrong. When a mother allowed him to test a different poultice on her child's rash, she did so because she trusted the hands that had tended her family for years. That trust was the most precious resource he had, and he guarded it as carefully as he guarded his notebooks. One morning, while preparing a mild decoction for a woman with a persistent cough, he noticed a subtle pattern in the way certain patients responded to a particular preparation. The decoction, when steeped slowly and strained through a cloth, seemed to leave a faint, pleasant warmth in the chest and a deeper, more restful sleep. He began to wonder whether the method of preparation, the length of infusion, the temperature of the water, the way the brew was strained, might influence the release of active compounds. It was a small thought, almost trivial, but it opened a door in his mind. He set up a series of careful observations. With the healer's blessing, he prepared the same plant in 3 different ways: a quick steep, a long simmer, and a gentle steam. He recorded not only the patient's subjective reports of relief, but also objective signs he could observe: the depth of sleep, the ease of breathing, the return of appetite. He noted the weather, the patient's recent diet, and the time of day the remedy was given. Each entry in his notebook became a small story, a narrative of cause and effect that he hoped would reveal patterns over time. The results were not dramatic, but they were consistent enough to be meaningful. The long simmer produced a deeper, more sustained relief for some patients. The steam eased congestion more quickly for others. He did not rush to conclusions. He wrote everything down with the same careful language he had learned in the university: observations, not claims; correlations, not causation. The healer read his notes and smiled, adding a few of her own marks in the margins. She liked the way he framed his curiosity, not as a conquest, but as a conversation. As his confidence in method grew, so did his willingness to ask difficult questions. He began to wonder about the biochemical reasons behind what he observed, not to reduce the healer's wisdom to mere chemistry, but to understand how the 2 languages might speak to one another. He sketched diagrams in the margins of his notebook, tentative arrows between plant compounds and bodily responses, always careful to mark them as hypotheses. He would later translate these sketches into more formal notes, but for now they were private maps of thought, the kind that grow slowly when tended. The village continued to be generous with its stories. An elder told him of a time when a drought had forced people to change their diets, and with it, the patterns of illness. A mother described how a lullaby, sung in a particular rhythm, seemed to soothe a child's fever more reliably than any poultice. These accounts were not scientific in the narrow sense, but they were data of another kind, lived experience, repeated across generations. He learned to treat them as evidence, to fold them into his observations rather than dismiss them as anecdote. One afternoon, a traveler arrived with a complaint that would test both his skill and his ethics. The man had been bitten by a small, venomous creature while crossing a river. The wound was swollen and painful, and the man's face was pale with shock. The healer and he worked quickly, using the techniques they had refined together: cleaning, cooling, and careful monitoring. The man's condition stabilized, but he remained weak and feverish. He wanted to return to the city for further treatment, and the healer spoke of the limits of what they could do here. The man's decision to stay or go was his to make, but the conversation that followed was instructive. The traveler asked about the remedies they had used and whether any of them might be adapted for broader use. He spoke of clinics and journals and the possibility of sharing knowledge beyond the village. The healer listened with a quiet gravity. She reminded him that knowledge carried context, that a remedy's meaning was bound up with the land and the people who had tended it. She did not reject the idea of sharing. She only insisted that it be done with respect and reciprocity. The traveler left with a promise to return with questions and with a willingness to learn rather than to take. That exchange crystallized a concern that had been growing in him: the ethics of knowledge. He had seen in other places how indigenous remedies could be extracted and commercialized without benefit to the communities that had cultivated them. He did not want to be an instrument of that kind of harm. He began to draft, in careful language, a set of principles he would follow. Always ask permission, always credit the source, always share benefits. He discussed these principles with the healer and the elders, and they nodded in approval. Their assent felt like a covenant, a moral framework that would guide his work. In the quiet of the evenings, he continued to refine small techniques. He learned to make a salve that combined a cooling vine with a resin that seemed to seal small cuts and reduce infection. He experimented with different carriers: animal fat, plant oil, and a paste of ground seeds, and observed how each affected absorption and comfort. He never claimed to have invented anything. He framed his work as a refinement of practices that had long existed. The healer would sometimes laugh softly and say that he was simply paying attention in a way that honored what had always been there. Children remained his most honest critics and his most eager students. They would test his salves on scraped knees and then run off to play, returning later with reports of how the skin had felt. Their feedback was immediate and unvarnished, and it taught him to value simplicity and comfort as much as efficacy. A remedy that worked but burned the skin would not be embraced. A remedy that soothed and allowed a child to sleep would be remembered and passed on. As months turned into a year, his notebooks filled with a slow accumulation of small truths. He began to see patterns that suggested broader principles. That preparation mattered as much as ingredient, that community rituals supported recovery, that prevention, through diet, movement, and social cohesion, was as powerful as any cure. He sketched a loose framework for a practice that might one day be taught, a curriculum that combined anatomy with plant knowledge, clinical observation with storytelling, and laboratory rigor with ritual respect. Yet even as his ideas took shape, he remained humble. He knew that the jungle had taught him to be patient, and that knowledge gained quickly was often knowledge lost. He continued to ask permission, to share credit, and to place the village's needs above any ambition. The stone in his pocket felt heavier now, not with burden but with the weight of responsibility. He touched it often, a small, steady reminder of the promise he had made long ago: to listen, to learn, and to keep the quiet work of healing true. One night, under a sky so thick with stars it seemed to hum, he sat with the healer and the elders and read aloud from his notebook. He read not as a scholar but as a friend, sharing observations and inviting correction. The elders listened and then offered stories that reframed his notes in ways he had not expected. They pointed out connections between a remedy and a ritual, between a plant's growth cycle and the timing of its harvest. Their insights were not footnotes but living commentary, and he felt, in that moment, the full circle of his work. He had come as a student, he had been welcomed as a practitioner, and now he was part of a conversation that would continue long after he was gone. He closed the notebook and looked up at the stars. The jungle around him breathed in a slow, steady rhythm, and he felt his own heartbeat match it. He had come to learn how to mend what was broken, but he had also learned how to hold what was whole. The discoveries he made were small and careful, but they were real, and they were shared. In the hush of that night, he whispered a promise to the land and to the people who had taught him, that he would carry their knowledge with honor, that he would protect it from harm, and that he would let his hands remain steady and kind. The quiet bloom of an idea. Spring arrived like a slow exhale, softening the edges of the long rains and coaxing new green from the earth. The village moved with the season, gardens filled with tender shoots, children chased one another beneath the shade of young leaves, and the air carried the faint, sweet scent of blossoms. He found that his own curiosity, which had been patient and steady, now felt like a small, persistent bloom, an idea that opened a little more each day. It began with a simple observation. A woman who worked in the communal kitchens had a habit of rinsing a particular leaf in warm water before adding it to stews. Those who ate the stews seemed to recover from minor stomach upsets more quickly than others. He noticed the pattern not as a dramatic revelation, but as a soft thread that, when tugged, revealed a weave of related practices. The healer smiled when he mentioned it and told him that the leaf had long been used as a digestive aid, but that its preparation mattered. Rinsed, warmed, and combined with a cooling herb, it was gentler on the stomach than when used raw. He began to think about combinations again, but with a new focus. Not only which plants worked together, but how the timing of harvest and the method of preparation might change their effects. He set up a careful series of observations, always with consent and always in collaboration with the healer. They recorded the age of the plant at harvest, the time of day it was picked, and the way it was processed. He wrote down the villagers, reports of comfort and discomfort, the return of appetite, the ease of digestion. Each entry was a small, careful step toward understanding. One afternoon, while preparing a salve for a man whose hand had been burned by a cooking fire, he noticed that a particular resin, when mixed with a cooling paste and applied gently, seemed to reduce the redness and the man's need to shift his hand away from the pain. The effect was subtle and not immediate, but it was consistent enough to be noticed by the patient and by those who watched. He recorded the observation, and with the healer's permission, tried a slightly altered preparation on a different patient. Again, the response was positive. He did not call it a discovery, he called it a pattern worth watching. As the weeks passed, patterns accumulated like small stones on a riverbank. A poultice applied with a clockwise motion seemed to reduce swelling more quickly in some cases. A tea steeped at low heat for a longer time produced a gentler, longer-lasting relief for others. He sketched tentative diagrams linking preparation methods to observed outcomes, always careful to label them as hypotheses. The healer read his notes and added her own marks, sometimes a single word in her language that meant remember or respect. Their collaboration felt less like a teacher and student and more like two hands shaping the same clay. Word of their careful work reached a neighboring settlement, and with it came a request. Could they help a woman whose childbirth had been complicated by a prolonged labor? The healer and he traveled with a small group, carrying only what they needed and the quiet confidence that comes from practice. The woman's labor was difficult, and the village's midwives had done what they could. They worked together, offering supportive measures and gentle encouragement. The outcome was not a dramatic rescue, but a steady, communal effort that brought the mother and child through the night. Afterwards, the midwives thanked them with a quiet ceremony, and he felt the deep, wordless gratitude that comes when a community holds life together. That night, as they returned to their village, he thought about the nature of his work. He had come to the jungle with the intention of learning, but he had also come to serve. The two aims had braided together into a single thread, to observe with rigor and to act with care. He began to see his notebooks not as a private archive, but as a shared resource, a living record that belonged to the people who had taught him. He spoke with the healer about how to preserve what they had learned without exposing it to exploitation. They agreed on simple principles: record with humility, share with consent, and protect the contexts that gave the knowledge meaning. In the quiet that followed, a small, unexpected breakthrough began to take shape. While comparing notes on wound care, he noticed that a certain combination of crushed leaf and resin, when applied after a gentle irrigation and left under a breathable dressing, seemed to reduce the incidence of infection in shallow cuts. He was careful with his language. He described what he had seen, not what he believed to be true in all cases. He repeated the observation across several patients, always with the healer's guidance and the community's permission. The pattern held often enough to be meaningful, and he began to sketch a more formal set of observations that might one day be shared beyond the village, but only if it could be done in a way that honored the people who had taught him. The ethical questions that had shadowed him since his arrival grew sharper as the possibility of a publishable finding emerged. He imagined the sterile pages of journals and the bright lights of conference halls, and he felt a tug of longing. He also imagined the ways knowledge could be taken out of context, stripped of its rituals and relationships, and turned into something that benefited others at the expense of the community. He spoke with the healer and the elders, and they spoke back with a wisdom that steadied him. Knowledge, they said, is like a river. It can nourish many, but it must be guided so that it does not flood and destroy. They devised a plan that was both practical and principled. He would continue his careful observations and refine his notes. Any sharing beyond the village would require explicit consent, and any benefits that arose would be returned to the community in ways they deemed appropriate. They would teach others within the region, strengthening local capacity rather than exporting secrets. The agreement felt right, and it eased the tension in his chest like a hand laid gently over a wound. As the season turned and the light softened into long, golden afternoons, he found himself more certain of his path. He would not rush to claim or to publish. He would let the work mature, like fruit ripening on the vine. He would continue to learn from the healer and the elders, to test with humility, and to protect what had been entrusted to him. The small stone in his pocket felt warm against his palm, a steady reminder of the promise he had made as a child. To listen, to learn, and to keep the quiet work of healing true. That night, under a sky freckled with stars, He wrote a single line in his notebook and then closed it. Observe with care, share with consent, heal with humility. He slept with the sound of the river in his ears and the slow, sure rhythm of his own heartbeat beneath his hand, ready for whatever the next day's quiet discoveries might bring. The first quiet breakthrough. The months of careful attention began to yield something that felt like a small, honest light. It did not arrive as a thunderclap or a dramatic revelation. It arrived as a series of tiny confirmations that, when gathered together, formed a pattern. He had learned to trust patterns. He had learned to trust the slow accumulation of small truths. This was one of those truths, a modest, repeatable effect that suggested a deeper mechanism at work. It began with a cluster of patients who presented with a persistent, low-grade infection after minor cuts and abrasions. In the humid season, such wounds were prone to lingering redness and a dull, spreading soreness. The tribe's remedies usually managed these cases well, but he noticed that when a particular resin was combined with a cooling paste and applied under a breathable dressing, the wounds healed with less scarring and fewer signs of infection. He recorded each case with the same meticulous care he had used in the university. Time of onset, method of preparation, environmental conditions, and the course of healing. He repeated the preparation across different patients and different contexts, always with consent and always with the healer's oversight. The pattern persisted. The resin paste dressing seemed to create a microenvironment that discouraged the growth of harmful organisms while supporting the tissue's own repair processes. He did not leap to chemical explanations. Instead, he sketched hypotheses in his notebook, tentative arrows linking resin compounds to antimicrobial effects and paste components to moisture regulation. He labeled these sketches as questions, not answers. Word of the consistent results spread slowly, carried by gratitude and quiet curiosity. A healer from a neighboring valley came to observe, and the two of them worked side by side, comparing notes and techniques. The visiting healer brought a different set of practices and a fresh perspective, and together they refined the preparation, a slightly different ratio of resin to paste, a gentler method of application, a shorter interval between dressing changes. Each refinement was a small experiment, and each experiment taught them something new about the balance between protection and exposure, between moisture and air. One evening, after a day of tending wounds and recording outcomes, he sat with the healer and the visiting practitioner and tried to put words to what they had seen. They spoke in a mixture of languages and gestures, and slowly a shared understanding emerged. The resin, they agreed, might contain compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. The paste, when prepared with a cooling herb, might reduce inflammation and keep the tissue supple. The dressing, breathable but protective, allowed the wound to remain clean without suffocating the skin. It was a practical synthesis of observation and craft. He felt a cautious excitement. This was the first time a pattern he had noticed had been tested and refined with others, and had held up under scrutiny. It was not a discovery in the grand sense, but it was a meaningful step, a reproducible practice that improved outcomes and that could be taught to others. He wrote the refined method in his notebook with careful instructions and clear notes about context, which resins were appropriate, which pastes were safe, and which combinations should be avoided. He added a line about consent and community ownership, a reminder that the practice belonged to the people who had tended it for generations. As the practice spread through neighboring settlements, he received messages carried by travelers, reports of fewer infections, of quicker healing, of less scarring. The news arrived without fanfare, in the form of a quiet gratitude that warmed him more than any public accolade could. He thought of the stone in his pocket and felt its steady weight. The promise he had carried since childhood had not been about fame. It had been about the small, steady work of easing suffering. This was that work, multiplied by careful attention and shared practice. With the spread of the method came new responsibilities. People from farther away began to ask for the recipe, and with each request, he felt the old ethical tension, the desire to help versus the need to protect the cultural context of the knowledge. He and the healer formalized their approach. They would teach the method to neighboring communities, prioritizing local capacity and mutual exchange. They would not hand the recipe to those who sought to profit without reciprocity. They would insist on credit and on benefit sharing. These were not legal documents, but moral commitments rooted in respect. The first formal teaching session was simple and intimate. They gathered under a broad tree, the air warm and still, and the healer demonstrated the preparation while he translated and took notes. They explained the reasons for each step, the signs to watch for, and the situations in which the method should not be used. They emphasized consent and the importance of observing outcomes. The participants practiced on small, simulated wounds and then on real cases under supervision. The learning was hands-on and communal, and the atmosphere was one of shared purpose rather than hierarchy. As the method took root, he began to think about how to bridge the language of the jungle with the language of the clinic. He sketched a simple protocol that combined observational markers with practical steps. How to assess a wound, when to apply the resin paste dressing, how often to change it, and what signs would indicate the need for referral. He wrote the protocol in plain language and in the healer's shorthand, and he left copies with the elders of each community. The protocol was not a replacement for judgment. It was a tool to guide careful hands. The first time a clinic nurse from the city came to observe, he felt a familiar nervousness. The nurse had heard of the practice through a traveler and wanted to see whether it might complement the clinic's wound care. He and the healer demonstrated the method, explained the context, and shared their observations. The nurse asked practical questions about sterility and about how the method might be adapted to a clinical setting. They spoke frankly about limits and about the need for further study. The nurse left with a respectful curiosity and a promise to consider how the practice might be integrated in ways that honored its origins. That night, as the village settled and the firelight made the faces around him soft and familiar, he reflected on the arc of the past year. He had arrived as a student with diagrams and a head full of names. He had been lost and found, taught and welcomed. He had learned to listen in ways that his textbooks had not taught him to do. The first quiet breakthrough was not an endpoint but a beginning, a proof that careful observation, ethical practice, and shared learning could produce meaningful improvements in care. He wrote the refined method in his notebook and added a short note to himself. Keep the work slow. Keep the work shared. Keep the work humble. He slept with the steady drum of his heartbeat beneath his hand and the soft chorus of the jungle outside, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept in small, steady acts. The quiet laboratory. The village had become, in his mind, a kind of laboratory, not one of glass and fluorescent light, but of soil and song, of patient observation and communal memory. He had learned to read the land the way he once read charts: the curve of a root, the sheen on a leaf, the way a vine curled toward the light. Each morning he walked the same narrow paths, not out of habit but out of devotion, cataloging small changes as if they were pages in a book that only revealed its meaning slowly. He began to formalize his notes in a way that felt respectful rather than invasive. He created a simple ledger: columns for plant name, local name, method of preparation, observed effect, and contextual notes. The weather, the patient's diet, the time of day. He wrote in 2 scripts: the precise, clinical shorthand he had learned at university, and the flowing marks the healer used to denote ritual and timing. The ledger became a bridge between 2 ways of knowing, and he treated it with the same care he would give a fragile specimen. One morning, while examining a patch of ground near the river, he noticed a cluster of small, pale flowers that seemed to bloom only after the rains had softened the soil. The healer smiled when he pointed them out and told him that the flowers were used in a cooling tea for fevers, but only when picked at dawn. She explained that the dew carried a subtle balance of compounds that the sun would alter by midday. He listened, fascinated by the way timing and environment shaped efficacy. He recorded the detail and added a small sketch, noting the exact hour and the weather conditions. This attention to timing opened a new avenue of inquiry. He began to test not only which plants were used, but when they were harvested and how that timing affected outcomes. With the healer's guidance, he prepared the same remedy from plants picked at different times of day and observed subtle differences in taste, aroma, and patient response. A leaf picked at dawn might yield a gentler infusion. The same leaf picked at noon could be more bitter, and in some cases, less well tolerated. He did not rush to generalize. He recorded, repeated, and waited for patterns to emerge. The village's children became his eager assistants in these small studies. They learned to wake early and to move quietly through the garden, their small hands careful as they plucked blossoms and leaves. They loved the ritual of weighing and measuring, of watching a brew change color as it steeped. Their laughter and curiosity lightened the work and reminded him that discovery could be playful as well as rigorous. He taught them to note the time and the weather, to smell a leaf and describe it in simple words. In teaching, he found a new joy: the slow passing of method and care to the next generation. As his ledger filled, he began to see connections that suggested broader principles. Plants that grew in shaded, moist areas often produced gentler infusions. Those that thrived in sun-exposed soil tended to yield stronger, more astringent compounds. He sketched diagrams linking microclimate to plant chemistry, always careful to mark them as hypotheses. He thought about how the land's diversity, the mosaic of shade and sun, wet and dry, created a palette of remedies that could be tuned by harvest time and preparation. A turning point came when a young hunter returned to the village with a deep puncture wound from a thorny vine. The wound had been cleaned, but had begun to show signs of a stubborn infection, redness creeping along the edges, and a dull, persistent pain. He and the healer prepared the resin paste dressing they had refined, but this case did not respond as quickly as others had. He felt the familiar tug of concern and the responsibility to adapt. He revisited his ledger and noticed a small, previously overlooked detail. The resin used in the earlier successful cases had been collected from trees that grew on a limestone ridge, while the resin available near the hunter's camp came from trees rooted in clay-rich soil. The observation was subtle, but it suggested that the same species might produce different compounds depending on the soil and the microenvironment. He proposed a cautious test: collect resin from trees in different locations, prepare the paste in the same way, and observe any differences in wound response. The healer agreed, and together they organized a small, careful collection trip. They moved slowly, honoring the trees and asking permission in the healer's language before taking any resin. The elders accompanied them, offering songs and small blessings that acknowledged the reciprocity of taking from the land. Back in the village, they prepared 3 batches of paste, each using resin from a different microhabitat. They applied the pastes to small, supervised cases with the community's consent and watched closely. Over the following days, subtle differences emerged. One batch seemed to reduce redness more quickly, another eased pain more effectively, and the third produced a slightly faster closure of the wound edges. He recorded everything with meticulous care, noting the soil type, the tree's exposure to sun, and the time of resin collection. The results were not definitive in the way a laboratory trial might be, but they were meaningful in the context of the village's practice. They suggested that the land's variability, the mosaic of microhabitats, mattered to the medicine it produced. The healer nodded when he shared his notes, adding a proverb about the land's many voices. The elders listened, and then suggested that future collections be guided by seasonal knowledge and by the trees themselves, which seemed to offer resin more readily at certain times. This small study shifted his thinking. He began to conceive of medicine not as a fixed recipe, but as a conversation with place, a practice that required attention to soil, season, and the subtle cues of the living world. He sketched a loose framework for what he called asterisk place-based practice, a set of principles that included respect for harvest timing, attention to microhabitat, and the integration of ritual and observation. He shared the framework with the healer and the elders, who offered refinements and cautions. They emphasized that such knowledge must remain rooted in community stewardship and must not be extracted for profit. As word of their findings spread, a small group of visiting scholars arrived, not the kind who sought to take, but those who came to learn and to listen. They observed the collection methods, the careful recording, and the communal decision-making. They asked questions about soil and season, about the ethics of sharing knowledge, and about the ways the village balanced openness with protection. He answered as best he could, translating between languages and between ways of thinking. The scholars left with notebooks full of questions, and with a promise to return with resources that might help the village preserve its knowledge on its own terms. The ledger continued to grow, and with it his sense of purpose. He no longer felt torn between 2 worlds. He felt that his work was to weave them together with care. He drafted a simple teaching plan that combined anatomy with plant ecology, clinical observation with ritual practice. The plan was not a curriculum for a distant university, but a living course that could be taught in the shade of the village's broad tree, with children and elders learning side by side. He proposed that the village host periodic gatherings where neighboring communities could share practices, and where knowledge could be exchanged with consent and reciprocity. One evening, as the sun sank and the firelight made the faces around him soft and familiar, he opened his ledger and read aloud a passage he had written months earlier. Medicine is a conversation with place. Listen before you speak. The healer smiled and added a line in her shorthand that meant, roughly, and remember to give thanks. The elders nodded, and the children, who had been playing nearby, came to sit at his feet. He felt, in that moment, the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept, the promise to learn, to serve, and to hold what he learned with humility. He slept that night with the ledger by his side and the slow, sure rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his hand. The jungle breathed around him, a vast, patient presence, and he felt himself part of its long, unfolding story. A single, careful voice in a chorus that had been singing long before he arrived and would continue long after he left. The quiet synthesis. He began to notice, with a slow and growing clarity, that the two languages he had learned, the clinical precision of the university and the relational, place-rooted wisdom of the tribe, were not opposing dialects but complementary ways of describing the same living processes. Where one offered mechanisms and measurable markers, the other offered context and timing, ritual, and the subtle cues of the land. The more he listened, the more he saw how a careful synthesis could produce a richer practice of care. The synthesis did not arrive as a single insight, but as a series of small, converging moments. A mother described how her child's cough eased after a steam treatment followed by a gentle chest massage. A hunter's wound closed more neatly when a resin-paste dressing was applied after a slow irrigation. An elder's chronic ache softened when diet, movement, and a cooling tea were combined over weeks. Each case suggested that outcomes improved when interventions addressed body, environment, and community together. He began to sketch a framework in his notebook, a loose architecture for practice that honored both evidence and story. He called the framework * quiet synthesis because it required listening more than speaking, observing more than asserting. The first principle was * context *. Remedies must be understood within the rhythms of place and season. The second was * method *. Preparation and timing matter as much as ingredient. The third was * community *. Healing is supported by social rituals, shared meals, and the presence of others. The fourth was humility *. Knowledge must be shared with consent and protected from exploitation. He wrote these principles in a single page and pinned it beneath a broad leaf in his hut as a daily reminder. To test the framework, he and the healer designed a series of integrated care plans for common ailments. For respiratory complaints, they combined steam treatments, dietary adjustments, and gentle breathing exercises taught by the elders. For wound care, they paired the resin-paste dressing with a protocol of irrigation, dressing changes, and communal support for mobility and nutrition. For chronic pain, they emphasized movement, sleep hygiene, and the use of cooling teas alongside topical applications. Each plan was simple, practical, and adaptable to the resources of neighboring settlements. They introduced the plans slowly, always with consent and always as options rather than mandates. The healer would explain the rationale in her language while he translated the clinical markers and signs to watch for. They emphasized observation, how to note improvement, when to pause, and when to seek referral. The community responded with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. People appreciated that the plans honored their rituals while offering new, tested methods that eased suffering. One afternoon, a midwife from a distant valley arrived with a question about postpartum recovery. She had heard of their integrated approach and wanted to learn how to support new mothers who often returned to heavy labor too soon. He and the healer welcomed her and together they developed a gentle postpartum protocol, a nourishing broth, a schedule of rest supported by family, topical applications to soothe perineal soreness, and a set of simple exercises to restore pelvic strength. They taught the protocol in a circle, with mothers and grandmothers sharing their own practices and adaptations. The midwife left with a bundle of notes and a promise to adapt the plan to her own community's rhythms. As the integrated plan spread, he found himself translating more than remedies. He translated ways of thinking, how to observe without rushing to a conclusion, how to weigh a patient's story as evidence, how to respect ritual as part of treatment. He taught simple clinical signs, pulse quality, breathing depth, skin temperature, and paired them with the healer's markers. The song that accompanied a remedy, the time of harvest, the way a plant's scent changed with the sun. Students who learned both languages began to move through the village with a new kind of confidence, able to hold a patient's hand while also noting subtle clinical changes. The work deepened his sense of belonging. He was no longer merely a visitor who had been sheltered. He was a participant in a living tradition that welcomed refinement and careful inquiry. The elders treated him as a colleague, offering corrections and stories that reframed his observations. The healer's trust became a steadying force. She would sometimes place her hand on his shoulder and say, in her language, a word that meant roughly, "Keep your heart steady." He learned to take that counsel seriously, to let steadiness guide his curiosity. With the growth of practice came new opportunities for collaboration. A small, respectful research group from a regional clinic proposed a joint observational study to document outcomes of the integrated wound care protocol across several communities, using simple, agreed-upon markers and a shared ledger. He and the healer agreed, but only after negotiating terms that protected the village's ownership of knowledge and ensured that any benefits would be returned to the communities involved. The study was modest, a careful, community-led documentation rather than a clinical trial, but it produced useful data. Fewer infections, shorter healing times, and improved patient comfort when the integrated protocol was followed. The results were shared in a way that honored the village's voice. Instead of a distant publication that stripped context, they produced a simple booklet written in the local language and in the clinic's language, illustrated with sketches and songs. The booklet described the protocol, the signs to watch for, and the ethical principles that guided the work. Copies were left with elders and midwives across the region. The act of sharing felt like a circle completed. Knowledge had been observed, refined, and returned in a form that strengthened local capacity. Despite the quiet successes, he remained vigilant about the risks of appropriation. He had seen how easily a remedy could be extracted and commodified, losing its ritual and its reciprocal obligations. He continued to insist on consent and reciprocity, and he taught others to do the same. When a representative from a distant organization asked for samples and recipes, the elders politely declined until clear agreements were made about benefit sharing and stewardship. The refusal was not a rejection of collaboration, but a protection of the community's integrity. In the evenings, when the work of the day had settled and the firelight made the faces around him soft and familiar, he would sit with his notebook and reflect. He wrote about the small, human moments that had shaped the synthesis. The way a child's laugh returned after a fever, the quiet gratitude of a mother whose wound healed with less scarring, the steady presence of elders who taught him to honor the land. He wrote about mistakes, too, the times when a preparation had caused irritation, or when his impatience had led him to test too quickly. He recorded failures as lessons, because the village had taught him that honesty was part of care. One night, under a sky thick with stars, the healer placed a small woven band on his wrist. It was a simple thing, made of dyed fibers and a single bead of polished wood. She spoke in her language and then in his, saying that the band was a sign of belonging and of responsibility. He accepted it with both hands, feeling the weight of the moment. The band was not a prize. It was a reminder to keep listening, to keep sharing, and to keep the work rooted in humility. The quiet synthesis continued to unfold, not as a finished product, but as an ongoing practice. He understood now that medicine was less a destination than a way of moving through the world, attentive, respectful, and always ready to learn. The promise he had carried since childhood had grown into something wider and more communal. It was no longer only about mending what was broken. It was about tending what was whole, protecting what was given, and walking gently between worlds with hands that knew how to heal. The quiet tests of trust. The village's trust felt less like a fragile gift and more like a living thread that needed tending. As their integrated practices spread, people came with questions that required not only skill but careful judgment. He found himself balancing the impulse to experiment with the obligation to protect the community's well-being. Each new test was proposed slowly, discussed openly, and accepted only when elders and families felt comfortable. The process itself became part of the medicine. Consent woven into practice, conversation braided with care. A seasonal illness arrived that year with a different face. It began as a mild malaise in a few households, and then, over several weeks, moved through the valley with a quiet persistence. Symptoms were varied: low fevers, a lingering cough, a heaviness that made work slow and breath shallow. The healer and he watched closely, noting patterns in their ledger and comparing them with stories from neighboring settlements. They did not rush to name the cause. Instead, they focused on observation, on supportive care, and on protecting the most vulnerable. Their integrated plans were put to the test. For those with cough and congestion, they offered steam treatments followed by gentle chest massage and a nourishing broth. For those whose energy waned, they emphasized rest, small, frequent meals, and teas that soothed the stomach and supported appetite. They monitored hydration and breathing, taught families how to recognize warning signs, and arranged for communal support so that those who were ill could rest without worry. The village's social fabric, shared meals, rotating care, and songs that eased anxiety, proved as important as any remedy. He recorded outcomes with a steady hand. Some recovered quickly with the integrated approach, others needed more time. A few cases grew more serious, and in those moments the healer and he made careful decisions about referral. They had established relationships with a regional clinic and had negotiated terms that respected the village's ownership of knowledge. When a patient's breathing worsened or a fever spiked, they arranged transport and accompanied the family, carrying not only the patient but also the context of care, notes, preparations, and the healer's observations. The clinic visits were humbling and instructive. In the bright, clinical rooms he saw technologies and tests that could clarify what they had only observed. Blood counts, imaging, and cultures offered pieces of a puzzle that the village's methods could not fully resolve. Yet he also saw the limits of technology when it stood alone. Sterile rooms that sometimes felt cold, hurried consultations that missed the rhythms of a patient's life. He returned to the village with new data and a renewed conviction that synthesis, not replacement, was the path forward. With the clinic's input, they refined their protocols. They added simple markers for referral that combined clinical thresholds with local signs. A breathing rate above a certain number, a fever that did not respond to supportive care, a change in mental alertness. They trained community members to measure and record these markers, to communicate clearly with clinic staff, and to accompany patients when transfer was needed. The system worked because it honored both precision and context. Numbers guided decisions, and stories guided interpretation. The seasonal illness eventually waned, leaving behind a valley that had been tested and found resilient. The experience deepened the community's confidence in their integrated approach and strengthened ties with the clinic. It also taught him a lesson about humility, that even careful observation and respectful practice must sometimes yield to technologies that can reveal hidden processes. He wrote the lesson into his ledger as a simple line: use tools when they help. Do not let tools replace listening. As the months passed, his role shifted subtly. He was still a student in many ways, but he had become a teacher and a coordinator. He organized gatherings where midwives, elders, and clinic nurses exchanged practices and refined protocols together. These gatherings were practical and ceremonial. They included demonstrations, hands-on practice, and the sharing of songs and stories that anchored the work in culture. He watched as local practitioners gained confidence, as midwives adapted postpartum protocols to their own rhythms, and as wound care methods were taught with the same care that had guided their creation. External interest continued to arrive, sometimes as curiosity and sometimes as pressure. Representatives from a distant research institute asked to document their methods for a broader study. He welcomed the chance to share knowledge, but insisted on terms that protected the village's rights. They negotiated agreements that required consent, benefit sharing, and community oversight. The Institute's researchers listened and learned, and when they left, they carried not only data, but also a deeper respect for the ethical framework the village had insisted upon. The negotiations were not always easy. He found himself translating not only language but values, explaining why a recipe could not be divorced from ritual, why a plant's name could not be taken without the story that gave it meaning. Sometimes outsiders were impatient, sometimes they were earnest. He learned to hold both responses with steadiness, to say no when necessary, and to say yes when the terms honored reciprocity. The work of protecting knowledge became as important as the work of discovering it. Amid these responsibilities, a quieter question tugged at him, the question of home. Letters from the university arrived sporadically, some with news of colleagues, others with reminders of obligations and opportunities. He thought of the anatomy hall and the antiseptic light, of professors who had once guided him with firm hands. He wondered whether his path would lead him back to formal study, perhaps to bring the village's insights into a broader conversation. Yet he also felt the deep roots he had grown here, friendships, obligations, and a sense of belonging that had reshaped his identity. One evening, after a long day of teaching and tending, he walked alone to the river and sat on a smooth stone. The water moved with a steady patience, reflecting the sky in a slow, shimmering sheet. He touched the small stone in his pocket and felt its familiar warmth. He thought of the promises he had made, to listen, to learn, to protect. He realized that any decision about leaving would need to honor those promises. If he returned to the university, it would be to build bridges, not to take. If he stayed, it would be to deepen the work of place-based practice and to train others to carry it forward. The choice did not present itself as a single, dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolded as a series of small decisions, a plan to formalize training sessions, a commitment to document methods with community oversight, a promise to negotiate fair partnerships with outside institutions. He began to sketch a modest proposal, a rotating program where students from the clinic could spend time in the village learning integrated care, and where village practitioners could visit the clinic to observe technologies and tests. The proposal emphasized reciprocity, shared governance, and the protection of cultural context. As he wrote, the healer came to sit beside him. She placed her hand on his and spoke in her language, then in his, saying simply that the land would guide him and that the people would support whatever choice honored the work. Her words were not a directive, but a blessing. He felt the weight of responsibility ease into something like clarity. He would not rush. He would continue to tend the village's needs and to build bridges that respected both worlds. That night, under a sky freckled with stars, he added a new line to his ledger: teach with humility, build bridges with care. He closed the book and slept with the steady drum of his heartbeat beneath his hand, ready for the quiet tests that the next season would bring. The quiet weight of choice. Seasons turned with a gentle inevitability, and with them came decisions that were less about technique and more about the shape of a life. He had arrived in the jungle as a student, then become a practitioner, and now found himself at a crossroads where duty, belonging, and possibility braided together into a single, heavy thread. The village had given him trust, the healer had given him partnership, and the land had given him lessons that no textbook could hold. Each gift carried an obligation, and obligations ask for answers. The question that pressed most often was simple in form and complex in consequence. What would he do with what he had learned? He imagined the sterile halls of the university and the careful language of journals, and he imagined the village's songs and the way elders taught by telling stories. He could return to the clinic world and try to translate the village's practices into formal studies, or he could remain, deepening the place-based work and training others to carry it forward. Both paths felt right in different ways. Both demanded care. He began to shape a plan that honored both impulses. It was not a grand design, but a series of small, practical steps. A rotating exchange where clinic students would spend time in the village learning integrated care. A modest archive, co-owned and curated by the elders, that recorded remedies alongside the stories and rituals that gave them meaning, and a set of community-led workshops to strengthen local capacity. He sketched budgets and schedules in his notebook, but more importantly, he sketched principles, consent, reciprocity, stewardship, that would guide every decision. The elders listened to his proposals beneath the broad tree where they often gathered. They asked questions that were not obstacles but clarifications. How would the village's voice be preserved? Who would decide when knowledge could be shared? How would benefits be returned? He answered as best he could, and when he did not know, he said so. The honesty mattered. They nodded slowly, offering small amendments and a proverb here and there that reframed his plans in the language of the land. Their involvement turned his tentative ideas into a communal project rather than a personal ambition. As plans took shape, external interest intensified. A regional health organization offered funding to support training and documentation. The offer was generous and practical, but it came with forms and timelines and a pressure to produce measurable outcomes. He and the healer read the proposal together, line by line, translating its requirements into the village's terms. They negotiated conditions that would protect the community's rights: shared governance of any funds, community oversight of documentation, and a clause that required any external publication to include the village's voice and consent. The organization agreed, and the funds arrived as a quiet, enabling presence rather than a commanding force. With resources in hand, they began to build modest infrastructure: a shaded teaching space with woven mats and simple tools, a small seed bank to preserve plant diversity, and a communal ledger that combined clinical markers with songs and stories. They hired a few local apprentices, young people who had grown up in the village and who wanted to learn both the healer's craft and the clinical markers he taught. Training sessions were slow and deliberate, mixing hands-on practice with storytelling and with the ethics of stewardship. The apprentices learned to measure a pulse and to sing a lullaby. They learned to prepare a poultice and to explain why a ritual mattered. The work of teaching deepened his sense of purpose. He found joy in the apprentices' small triumphs: a steady hand tying a secure knot, a clear note in the ledger that tracked a patient's improvement, a child's fever breaking after a night of careful care. He also felt the weight of responsibility when mistakes were made. Once, a hurried decision led to a poultice left on too long, and a patient's skin became irritated. The healer and he addressed the error openly, using it as a lesson in humility and in the importance of patience. The apprentices learned that mistakes were part of learning, but that honesty and repair were essential. As the program matured, he began to travel more frequently to the clinic and to the university. Each trip was a careful negotiation. He carried notes and samples, always with the elders' permission and with clear agreements about use. He presented their observational data at small, respectful gatherings rather than at grand conferences, emphasizing context and community ownership. He spoke of preparation, timing, and ritual as integral to outcomes, and he insisted that any collaboration include benefit sharing and local governance. Some listeners were skeptical. Others were quietly moved by the humility and rigor of their approach. One visit brought an unexpected opportunity: an invitation to co-teach a short module at the regional clinic on integrated, place-based care. He accepted with the healer's blessing and prepared a curriculum that balanced clinical markers with stories and practical demonstrations. The module was intimate and hands-on, and it drew nurses and midwives who were hungry for approaches that honored culture as part of care. Participants practiced wound care protocols, learned to read the healer's shorthand, and sat in circles where elders shared songs that accompanied remedies. The module did not convert anyone to a single truth. Instead, it opened a space for respectful exchange. Back in the village, life continued in its steady rhythm. Gardens needed tending, children needed care, and the ledger required constant attention. He found that the more he traveled, the more he appreciated the quiet, daily work that sustained the community. He returned from each trip with new questions and with a renewed commitment to protect what had been entrusted to him. The apprentices had grown in skill and confidence, and the healer's hands, though older, remained steady and sure. Their partnership had become a model of mutual respect. Amid the practicalities, a quieter transformation took place within him. The boy who had once pressed his palm to his mother's wrist and promised to mend what was broken had become a man whose promise had widened to include a people and a place. His identity was no longer split between two worlds. It was braided. He felt the steady drum of his heartbeat as both a personal rhythm and a shared pulse with the village. The stone in his pocket had become a talisman of responsibility rather than a private relic. One evening, as the sun sank and the firelight made the faces around him soft and familiar, the healer called a small gathering. She spoke in her language, then in his, and presented him with a simple staff carved from a fallen branch. It was not a symbol of authority but of service, a tool to steady a hand, to lean on during long walks, and to remind him of the path he had chosen. He accepted it with both hands, feeling the grain of the wood and the warmth of the moment. The elders sang a low, steady song, and the children clapped softly, their faces bright with the kind of joy that needs no words. He slept that night with the staff leaning against his hut and the ledger open on his lap. The choices he had made were not final. They were commitments that would require constant tending. But he felt a calm certainty that the path he walked honored the promises he had carried since childhood. To listen, to learn, to protect, and to heal with humility. The jungle breathed around him, patient and vast, and he felt himself part of its long, unfolding story. A single, careful voice in a chorus that would continue long after he was gone. The quiet return. He traveled back to the clinic with a small satchel of notes and a heart that felt both heavy and light. The road out of the valley was a slow ribbon of dust and green, and with each mile the landscape shifted in ways that reminded him how much place shapes a person. He carried the village's ledger like a talisman, its pages filled with sketches, songs, and careful observations. He had promised the elders that any journey beyond the valley would be taken with their consent and their voice, and he honored that promise by bringing their questions and their conditions with him. The clinic's fluorescent lights felt sharp after the soft canopy of the jungle. Machines hummed with a steady, clinical certainty, and the air smelled of antiseptic and paper. Colleagues greeted him with warm curiosity. Some had heard of the integrated practices and wanted to learn. Others were skeptical but polite. He presented their observational data in a modest way, emphasizing context and consent. He spoke of preparation, timing, and the social rituals that supported recovery, and he insisted that any collaboration include benefit sharing and community oversight. A small research team listened with interest and proposed a pilot study that would document outcomes of the integrated wound care protocol in a controlled, respectful way. He agreed only after the elders' conditions were written into the agreement. The village would co-own the data. Any publications would include the village's voice, and benefits would be returned in forms the community chose. The team accepted, and the pilot began as a careful, community-led project rather than an extractive study. He felt a cautious hope. That knowledge could be shared without being taken. The weeks in the clinic were instructive. He observed tests and imaging that clarified processes the village had only been able to infer. He watched how a culture of numbers could bring clarity, and he also noticed how easily numbers could obscure the human story behind them. He returned to the village with new questions and with a renewed conviction that synthesis, not replacement, was the path forward. He brought back small tools and supplies the elders had requested, but he also brought a deeper respect for the limits of translation between worlds. Back in the valley, the rhythm of life resumed with a comforting steadiness. The apprentices had grown in skill and confidence. The healer's hands remained steady and sure. The pilot study began with careful documentation, standardized markers paired with the healer's notes and the songs that accompanied each remedy. The process was slow and deliberate, and the community's oversight ensured that the work remained rooted in local priorities. When preliminary results suggested improved outcomes with the integrated protocol, the village celebrated quietly, not with fanfare but with shared meals and a ceremony of thanks to the land. The pilot's modest success opened new doors and new conversations. Representatives from a regional health council asked to visit and to learn how the village's practices might inform broader public health strategies. He and the healer welcomed them, but they insisted on the same terms of consent and reciprocity. The council listened and then proposed a small program to support place-based training across several communities, modeled on the village's approach. The program would fund apprenticeships, seed banks, and community-led documentation. The elders agreed, seeing in the proposal a way to strengthen local capacity rather than to export knowledge. As the program grew, so did his responsibilities. He found himself moving between worlds more often, teaching in the shade of the village tree one week, presenting observational findings in a clinic meeting the next. The movement was tiring at times, but it also felt right. He had become a translator of sorts, not of words alone, but of values and practices. He learned to carry the village's voice with care, to insist on ethical terms, and to refuse offers that threatened the community's integrity. Amid the practical work, a quieter transformation continued within him. He had once imagined that his path would be linear: study, practice, mastery. The jungle had taught him otherwise. His life had become braided with relationships and responsibilities that required constant tending. He found joy in small, steady acts, teaching an apprentice to feel for a pulse, watching a child's fever break after a night of careful care, listening to an elder tell a story that reframed a clinical observation. These moments were the true measure of his work. One evening, after a long day of teaching and tending, he walked to the river and sat on a familiar stone. The water moved with a steady patience, reflecting the sky in a slow, shimmering sheet. He touched the small stone in his pocket and felt its familiar warmth. He thought of the choices he had made and the promises he had kept. He realized that his life no longer fit neatly into the categories he had once known. He was both a student and a teacher, a bridge and a steward. The realization brought a calm clarity rather than a crisis. The elders noticed the change in him and in their quiet way acknowledged it. They invited him to a small ceremony where they thanked him for his care and his restraint. They spoke of the land's long memory and of the responsibility that comes with knowledge. The healer placed her hand on his shoulder and said, in her language, a phrase he had come to cherish: "Stay steady, keep listening." He accepted the blessing with humility, feeling the weight of the moment like a gentle hand on his back. As the seasons turned, the program matured into a living network of communities that shared practices with consent and reciprocity. Apprentices trained in the village returned to their homes with knowledge and with a commitment to protect the cultural contexts that made the remedies meaningful. The seed bank preserved plant diversity, and the ledger, co-owned and curated, became a resource for local practitioners. He continued to travel, to teach, and to learn, but his center remained the valley and the people who had welcomed him. In quiet moments, he still opened his notebook and sketched hypotheses and questions. He continued to test with care, to record with honesty, and to share only with consent. He had learned that discovery without stewardship could harm, and he had chosen a path that honored both curiosity and care. The stone in his pocket had become a symbol of that choice, a reminder that promises are kept not by grand gestures, but by steady, daily acts. One night, under a sky freckled with stars, he sat by the fire with the healer and the apprentices. They spoke of small things, a new seedling in the garden, a child's laughter, a patient who had returned to work after months of pain. The conversation was ordinary and profound, stitched from the fabric of daily life. He felt in that moment the quiet satisfaction of a life that had found its shape, a life of listening, learning, and tending. The jungle breathed around them, patient and vast, and he felt himself part of its long, unfolding story. A single, careful voice in a chorus that would continue long after he was gone. The quiet of small miracles. The work had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and alive with possibility. Each morning he rose with the light, walked the narrow paths to the garden, and checked the seedlings as if they were patients whose progress could be read in the curve of a leaf. The apprentices moved beside him, their hands learning the same careful motions he had practiced for years. How to crush a leaf without bruising it too much, how to warm a poultice until it smelled like the place it came from, how to listen to a chest and hear the difference between a cough that would pass and one that needed more attention. The ledger on his table grew thicker with observations, and with it came a quiet confidence that small, repeated acts could become something like a craft. A series of modest experiments began to yield results that felt, in their own way, miraculous. Not miracles of sudden cures or dramatic reversals, but the kind that arrive as steady improvements. A child's cough that eased enough for sleep to return, a wound that closed with less scarring, an elder's pain that softened so she could walk to the river again. He and the healer refined combinations of plants and methods, always careful to test one variable at a time and to record outcomes with the same rigor he had once reserved for lab notebooks. The apprentices learned to note not only whether a remedy worked, but how it felt to the patient, the warmth of a compress, the relief of breath, the comfort of a hand held in the dark. One small breakthrough came from an unlikely place, a bitter root that the women used in small amounts to flavor a stew. When prepared as a gentle infusion and combined with a cooling leaf, the brew seemed to ease the restless nights of several elders whose sleep had been broken by aches and a low, nagging cough. He did not claim to have discovered a cure. He described the pattern and repeated the preparation across different households. The elders reported deeper sleep and fewer nighttime awakenings. The healer smiled and added a story about how the root had been used in old times to soothe travelers on long journeys. The combination of observation and story made the finding feel less like a claim and more like a gift returned to the community. Another quiet success involved a topical application for burns. A young mother arrived with a hand reddened and blistered from a cooking accident. The village's usual salves soothed pain, but left the skin tender for weeks. He and the healer tried a new preparation, a resin blended with a cooling paste and a small amount of crushed seed oil that the apprentices had learned to press gently. The dressing was breathable and changed frequently, and the mother reported less pain and a quicker return to normal use. The result was not universal, but it was consistent enough to be taught and adapted. The apprentices practiced the method until their hands were steady, and the mother's gratitude was a quiet, bright thing that warmed the village. With each small success came ethical questions that required more than clinical judgment. Travelers and neighboring settlements began to ask for the recipes and the methods. He felt the old tug of responsibility, the desire to help widely and the duty to protect the cultural context that made the remedies meaningful. He and the healer continued to insist on consent and reciprocity. They taught the methods in person, in circles where songs and stories accompanied the steps, and they refused to hand over recipes as if they were mere formulas. The elders supported this approach, reminding him that knowledge carried obligations and that the land's gifts were not commodities to be traded without care. The apprentices grew into their roles with a steady grace. One of them, a young woman named Amara, showed a particular talent for observation. She could notice the faintest change in a patient's breathing or the subtle shift in a wound's color that signaled improvement. He watched her teach a younger child how to feel for a pulse, and he felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with stewardship. The village's future, he realized, would be carried by hands like hers, hands that knew both the songs and the clinical markers, hands that could hold a patient's story while also measuring a fever. Not all experiments succeeded. There were times when a preparation caused irritation or when a patient's condition worsened despite careful care. Each failure was met with honesty. They recorded what had happened, discussed possible causes, and adjusted their methods. The healer taught the apprentices that mistakes were part of learning, but that transparency and repair were essential. When a poultice had been left on too long and caused a rash, they treated the rash openly and used the incident as a lesson in patience. The community's response, a mixture of concern and practical help, reinforced the idea that medicine was a communal act, not a solitary triumph. As their reputation grew, so did the complexity of requests. A delegation from a distant valley asked whether the village could help with a mysterious wasting illness that had been moving slowly through their people. The healer and he traveled with a small team, carrying notes and a calm determination. They observed, they listened, and they offered supportive measures, nourishing broths, rest, and gentle topical care for secondary infections. They also collected careful observations and samples, always with consent and with the elders' oversight. The illness resisted easy explanation, and the team worked with clinic partners to run tests that could reveal underlying causes. The collaboration was slow and sometimes frustrating, but it was also a model of how different systems could work together without erasing one another. The moral dilemmas that accompanied their work were not abstract. One day, a pharmaceutical representative arrived with an offer, funding for a formal study and the promise of bringing a remedy to market. The representative spoke of scale and impact, of the potential to help many more people. He listened politely, feeling the old tug of ambition and the new weight of responsibility. He and the healer consulted the elders and the apprentices. They asked hard questions. Who would own the knowledge? How would benefits be shared? Would the ritual and the context be preserved or stripped away? The representative's answers were vague on matters of reciprocity and stewardship. In the end, the village declined. The decision was not a rejection of collaboration, but a protection of the community's integrity. They would not allow their knowledge to be turned into a commodity without clear, enforceable terms that honored the land and the people. The refusal did not end interest. It redirected it. Scholars and clinicians who respected the village's terms came to learn and to listen. They offered resources for seed banks, for apprenticeships, and for community-led documentation. He accepted these partnerships cautiously, always insisting on co-ownership and on the inclusion of songs and stories in any record. The result was a modest archive that combined clinical markers with ritual notes, a living ledger that belonged to the people who had taught him. The archive was not a closed vault, but a shared garden, accessible to those who asked with respect and who agreed to the village's terms. Amid the ethical negotiations and the careful experiments, small human moments continued to shape his days. He sat with a mother as she nursed a fevered child through the night, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath and the quiet trust that passed between them. He watched apprentices teach one another, their hands steady and their voices patient. He listened to elders tell stories that reframed clinical observations as part of a larger life. These moments were the true measure of his work, not the number of papers or the reach of a remedy, but the way a community held itself together through care. One evening, after a long day of tending and teaching, he walked to the river and sat on a familiar stone. The water moved with a steady patience, reflecting the sky in a slow, shimmering sheet. He touched the small stone in his pocket and felt its familiar warmth. He thought of the choices he had made and the promises he had kept. He realized that the quiet miracles he had witnessed were not the result of a single insight, but of a way of living, attentive, humble, and communal. The promise he had carried since childhood had grown into something wider and more enduring. It was no longer only about mending what was broken. It was about tending what was whole, protecting what was given, and walking gently between worlds with hands that knew how to heal. The quiet reckoning. The valley had grown used to the rhythm of careful work. Mornings of gathering and preparation, afternoons of tending and teaching, evenings of stories and ledger entries. Yet even the gentlest rhythms can be interrupted by a note that does not fit the pattern, a cough that deepens, a fever that lingers, a rumor that arrives on the wind. That season brought such a note, subtle at first, then louder as it threaded through neighboring settlements and finally reached the village like a distant drum. It began with a traveler who arrived at dusk, his shoulders bowed and his breath shallow. He carried news of a distant town where a new illness had moved through families, leaving weakness and a slow wasting in its wake. The healer and he listened without haste, recording the traveler's story in the ledger and comparing it with the patterns they had seen in the valley. They did not panic. Panic had no place in careful work. Instead, they prepared. They reviewed their protocols, checked supplies, and reminded apprentices of the signs that required urgent referral. The first cases in the valley were mild, a low fever, a cough that lingered beyond the usual season. Families tended their own with the familiar rituals, steam treatments, nourishing broths, rest supported by neighbors. But as weeks passed, a few patients developed a deeper fatigue that did not respond to the usual measures. The healer and he watched closely, noting subtle changes in appetite, in the depth of sleep, in the way a child's laughter thinned. They consulted the clinic partners and arranged for tests when possible. But the valley's resources were limited, and the illness did not always show clear markers on the tests available. The uncertainty weighed on him. He had learned to live with questions, to let hypotheses sit like seeds until they could be tended. But this felt different. A responsibility that reached beyond notebooks and into the fragile lives of people he loved. He spent long hours by the bedside of those who were ill, feeling for pulses, listening to breath, and offering what comfort he could. The apprentices moved with steady hands, their faces set in the calm concentration that comes from practice. The healer's presence was a constant anchor. She sang low songs that seemed to steady the air itself. As the illness spread slowly, external interest intensified. A regional health team arrived with equipment and tests that could not be found in the valley. They worked respectfully, guided by the village's terms, and they brought data that clarified some aspects of the condition. Yet the data did not provide a simple answer. The illness appeared to be multifactorial, influenced by nutrition, environmental exposures, and perhaps a pathogen that behaved differently in different contexts. The clinic's specialists spoke in careful tones about the limits of certainty and the need for integrated responses that combined clinical care with social support. The village responded with the same ethic that had guided their work from the beginning. They strengthened communal care. Neighbors took turns preparing broths. Apprentices organized rest schedules so families could tend to the ill without collapsing under labor. And elders led rituals that eased anxiety and reinforced social bonds. The healer and he coordinated with the clinic to ensure that those who needed advanced care could be referred promptly, and they documented outcomes with meticulous attention. The ledger filled with observations that were both clinical and human. Notes on appetite and sleep, on the songs that soothed, on the small comforts that eased breath. The crisis sharpened his sense of duty and of limits. He found himself pulled between two kinds of action: the immediate, hands-on care that the village needed, and the broader work of advocacy and partnership that could bring resources and research. He traveled to the clinic more frequently, carrying not only samples and notes, but also the voices of families who needed support. He negotiated for supplies and for a small mobile unit that could bring diagnostics closer to the valley. Each negotiation required patience and insistence. He learned to speak the language of forms and budgets without losing the humility that had guided him since his arrival. In the quiet hours, when the village slept and the firelight made the faces around him soft and familiar, he wrestled with a deeper reckoning. The work he had built, the apprentices, the seed bank, the ledger, had grown into something resilient, but it was also vulnerable to forces beyond the valley's control. Climate shifts that altered plant cycles, outside interests that could commodify knowledge, and illnesses that did not respect borders. He thought of the promises he had made: to listen, to learn, to protect. He felt the weight of those promises like a steady hand on his shoulder. The crisis also revealed the depth of what they had created. When a family faced the prospect of a long illness, the village gathered not only to provide remedies, but to hold the story of the person who was ill. Meals were shared, songs were sung, and the burden of care was distributed so that no single household bore it alone. The apprentices stepped forward with competence and compassion, and the healer's steady presence reminded everyone that medicine is as much about presence as it is about technique. In those moments, he saw the true measure of their work, not the number of protocols written or the reach of a remedy, but the way a community held itself together in the face of uncertainty. A turning point came when a small, careful intervention, a combination of nutritional support, steam treatments, and a topical regimen to prevent secondary infections, produced consistent improvements in a cluster of patients. The clinic's tests suggested that the intervention supported immune resilience and reduced complications. The result was not a cure, but it was a meaningful reduction in suffering. They documented the approach, shared it with neighboring settlements, and taught it in circles where songs and stories accompanied the steps. The intervention spread quietly, carried by trust rather than by headlines. The experience left him changed. He had always known that medicine required humility, but the crisis deepened that lesson into a quiet conviction. That care must be woven into the fabric of life, that knowledge must be protected by relationships, and that resilience is built by communities who share burdens and resources. He added new lines to the ledger, notes on nutrition and rest, on the timing of harvests that supported immune health, and on the rituals that eased anxiety. He revised training modules to include crisis response and community coordination, and he worked with the clinic to establish a small rapid response plan that respected local governance. When the immediate crisis eased, the valley did not return to its former simplicity. The ledger was thicker, the apprentices more seasoned, and the network of partnerships stronger and more cautious. He felt a quiet gratitude for the way the village had held itself and for the way the healer's wisdom had guided every decision. He also felt a renewed sense of purpose, to continue building bridges that honored the land and the people, to protect knowledge from exploitation, and to teach others how to listen with care. On a cool evening, after a day of tending and teaching, he walked to the river and sat on a familiar stone. The water moved with a steady patience, reflecting the sky in a slow, shimmering sheet. He touched the small stone in his pocket and felt its familiar warmth. He thought of the promises he had kept and of the new ones he would make, to teach with humility, to protect with vigilance, and to keep the quiet work of healing true. The jungle breathed around him, patient and vast, and he felt himself part of its long, unfolding story. A single, careful voice in a chorus that would continue long after he was gone. The quiet of legacy. Years had a way of folding into one another like pages in a well-read book. The valley's seasons continued their patient turn, and with each cycle the work he had helped shape deepened roots. Apprentices became practitioners, seedlings became groves. The ledger's pages thickened with stories and careful observations. The village moved with a steadiness that felt like a living promise, and he found himself less a visitor and more a steward of a practice that belonged to many hands. The program they had built matured into a network of small, interlinked communities. Practitioners traveled between valleys to teach and to learn, carrying with them not only recipes and protocols, but songs, stories, and the ethical framework that had guided the village from the beginning. The seed bank preserved varieties that once might have been lost to shifting rains, and the shaded teaching space under the broad tree became a place where elders and students met in equal measure. He watched as knowledge spread in ways that honored context. Methods were taught in circles, rituals were explained alongside steps, and consent was woven into every exchange. His own role shifted again. He still tended patients and still walked the narrow paths at dawn, but more of his time was spent in quiet coordination, negotiating fair partnerships, ensuring that benefits returned to communities, and mentoring a new generation of stewards. He found satisfaction in the small administrative acts that kept the work ethical and sustainable. Drafting agreements that protected community ownership, helping apprentices write clear notes that combined clinical markers with songs, and advising visiting scholars on how to listen rather than to extract. One morning, a letter arrived from the university where he had once been a student. It was an invitation to speak at a small symposium on integrative care, a modest gathering of clinicians and community practitioners who wanted to learn from place-based models. He accepted with the healer's blessing and traveled with a small delegation of apprentices and elders. He carried not only his own notes but the ledger's voice, stories, songs, and the simple principles that had guided their work. When he spoke, he did not present a polished theory but a lived practice. The importance of timing, the ethics of consent, the power of community rituals. The audience listened with a respectful quiet, and some left with a new sense of how medicine could be both precise and humble. Back in the valley, life continued in its steady, ordinary ways. Children grew taller, gardens yielded new varieties, and the apprentices taught others to feel for a pulse and to sing a lullaby that soothed a fever. He found joy in the small, human moments that had always been the heart of the work: a mother's quiet thanks, a child's laughter after a night of careful care, an elder's steady step regained after months of pain. These were the measures that mattered most. A new generation of leaders emerged among the apprentices. Amara, whose hands had once been tentative, now moved with a calm authority that made patients relax the moment she touched them. She taught with the same humility the healer had shown him, and she added her own gifts, a gentle way of explaining clinical signs to families, and a knack for organizing community rotations that kept care accessible. He watched her teach a circle of young students and felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with stewardship. The ledger became a living archive curated by the community. Pages were written in many hands: sketches of leaves, notes on harvest timing, songs transcribed in careful script, and clinical markers recorded with steady precision. The elders insisted that the ledger remain accessible to those who asked with respect and who agreed to the village's terms. It was not a closed vault, but a shared garden, tended by many and offered with care. As the years passed, he found himself reflecting on the arc of his life. The boy who had pressed his palm to his mother's wrist and promised to mend what was broken had become a man whose promise had widened to include a people and a place. He had learned that healing was not a solitary act, but a communal practice that required humility, patience, and a willingness to be changed by the land and its people. The stone in his pocket had become a quiet talisman of responsibility rather than a private relic. One evening, the healer called a gathering beneath the broad tree. The apprentices, elders, and neighbors came together in the soft light of dusk. She spoke in her language and then in his, offering a blessing that acknowledged the work they had done together and the care they had taken to protect what had been entrusted to them. She placed her hand on his shoulder and said, in the language he had come to love, a phrase that had become a compass: "Stay steady, keep listening." The words were simple and true, and he felt their weight like a warm hand on his back. In the quiet that followed, he walked the familiar paths and visited the places where small discoveries had been made. He touched the trees that had offered resin, smelled the leaves that had soothed fevers, and listened to the songs that had accompanied remedies for generations. He felt a deep gratitude for the way the village had welcomed him, taught him, and trusted him to carry their knowledge with care. The promise he had carried since childhood had been kept, not as a solitary achievement, but as a shared life. As night fell and the stars embroidered the sky, he sat by the river and opened the ledger. He read entries written by apprentices and elders, notes that combined clinical markers with stories and songs. He added a small line of his own: teach with humility, protect with vigilance, love the work. He closed the book and slipped the stone back into his pocket, feeling its familiar warmth. The jungle breathed around him, patient and vast, and he felt himself part of its long, unfolding story. A single, careful voice in a chorus that would continue long after he was gone. The quiet ending and the long beginning. The final part of a long journey rarely arrives with fanfare. It comes as a soft settling, a sense that the work has been done well enough to be carried forward by others. For him, the ending was not a single moment, but a series of small, deliberate acts that prepared the village and the network for life without his constant presence. He did not leave abruptly. He stepped back with intention, ensuring that the structures they had built were resilient and that the ledger's voice would remain rooted in community stewardship. He began by formalizing the apprenticeship program into a rotating fellowship run by the elders and led by practitioners like Amara. The fellowship emphasized hands-on learning, ethical stewardship, and the integration of clinical markers with ritual practice. He helped draft simple governance documents that ensured community oversight of any external partnerships, and that required consent and benefit sharing for any use of the village's knowledge. The documents were written in plain language and in the healer's shorthand, and they were discussed and amended in circles until everyone felt they honored the land and the people. He also worked to strengthen local capacity for conservation. The seed bank received additional support, and a small nursery was established to propagate plants that were becoming rarer due to shifting rains. The community organized seasonal harvest calendars that respected plant cycles and ensured sustainable use. These practical measures were accompanied by rituals of thanks and reciprocity. Songs sung when seeds were planted, offerings made to the land when resin was collected, and stories told to remind each generation of the obligations that come with taking. When the time came for him to travel beyond the valley for an extended period, the farewell was quiet and full of meaning. The healer and the elders gathered beneath the broad tree and offered him a woven cloak, dyed with colors that echoed the river and the forest. They spoke in their language and then in his, offering blessings and reminders. Amara clasped his hand and promised to carry the work with steady hands and a listening heart. The apprentices presented him with a small bundle of seeds and a page from the ledger, a reminder that the work would continue in many hands. He left with a satchel of notes and a heart that felt both heavy and light. The road out of the valley was a slow ribbon of dust and green, and with each mile the landscape shifted in ways that reminded him how much place shapes a person. He traveled to speak, to teach, and to build bridges that honored the village's terms. He visited clinics and universities, always carrying the ledger's voice and the healer's counsel. He insisted on ethical partnerships and on the protection of cultural context. He taught others how to listen, how to ask for consent, and how to weave community into care. Yet the valley remained his center. He returned often, not as a leader but as a friend and a steward who had been invited back into a circle. Each visit was a renewal, a night of shared songs, a morning of teaching under the broad tree, a walk through the gardens to check seedlings. He watched as new apprentices took on responsibilities and as the fellowship matured into a living institution that belonged to the people. The ledger continued to grow, its pages filled with many hands and many voices. In the quiet moments, he reflected on the arc of his life. He had come to the jungle as a student with diagrams and a head full of names. He had been lost and found, taught and welcomed. He had learned to listen in ways that his textbooks had not taught him to do. He had helped build a practice that honored both precision and place, and he had worked to protect the knowledge that had been entrusted to him. The stone in his pocket had become a symbol of promises kept. To listen, to learn, to protect, and to heal with humility. The story did not end with his leaving. It continued in the hands of apprentices and elders, in the songs sung at dusk, and in the ledger that remained a living archive. The practices they had refined spread quietly, carried by trust, and by careful agreements that honored reciprocity. The network of communities grew stronger, not by exporting secrets, but by strengthening local capacity and by teaching others how to listen. On a final evening, as the sun sank and the firelight made the faces around him soft and familiar, he sat beneath the broad tree with the healer and the apprentices. They spoke of small things, a new seedling in the garden, a child's laughter, a patient who had returned to work after months of pain. The conversation was ordinary and profound, stitched from the fabric of daily life. The healer placed her hand on his and said, in the language he had come to love, the phrase that had guided him for years, "Stay steady, keep listening." He accepted the blessing with humility, feeling the weight of the moment like a warm hand on his back. He slept that night with the ledger by his side and the slow, sure rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his hand. The jungle breathed around him, patient and vast, and he felt himself part of its long, unfolding story. A single, careful voice in a chorus that would continue long after he was gone. The promise he had carried since childhood had been kept, not as a solitary triumph, but as a shared life. A life of listening, learning, and tending, and the quiet knowledge that every ending is also the beginning of something that will be carried forward by many hands.